So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm an insect ecologist working at the University of Florida, and my lab deals primarily with butterfly conservation, but increasingly also with native pollinator conservation. And we work in many different landscapes. And so the talk tonight is going to be a little different than what I normally provide. And I really want to talk a little bit about kind of the growing network of different types of landscapes and how important they are, especially now more than ever, for the future of biodiversity on this planet, but particularly for insects. And you'll see obvious connections with Connect to Protect as I go along. But I want to start simply by re-emphasizing the importance of insects. They are clearly the most diverse components of terrestrial ecosystems. Today, there's a little over 1 million described species on the planet, which account for a little over 80% of all animal life on planet Earth. And I love this next figure because at any given time, it's estimated that there are approximately 10 quintillion different insects alive. And that's a number that's almost incomprehensible. That gets into sort of quantum physics or, space dynamics when it comes to the number of individual organisms, but it reemphasizes the fact that insects are pretty ubiquitous and just incredibly numerous, incredibly diverse on this planet. And they provide so many incredible benefits to the world around us. They really contribute significantly to the functional biodiversity of this planet. And up on the screen are just listed a few of the kind of key ecosystem services that insects in general provide, including pollination, natural pest control, nutrient recycling, decomposition, food for wildlife. And so they really are tied intrinsically to the dynamics, productivity, stability, and health of both wild and human-made systems. And we would be in a really much of a pickle if insects were to fall off the planet tomorrow. They just provide so many critical benefits, but unfortunately, as all of you know, they're often viewed in a very negative light, and they certainly do not deserve that viewpoint. The roles that they play are so critical to life on Earth. And if you drill down simply into insect pollination, it's estimated on the planet that about 87.5% of all flowering plants rely on animal pollination. And of course, the bulk of this service is delivered by insects. And this is critical in so many ways, right? It's food for wildlife. It's the functioning and productivity of natural systems. It's the health and productivity and sustainability of agricultural systems. It's seed production for biofuel production. It's healthy and diverse forage for cattle and other ruminants. And you can make a really good argument as well that without the insect plant kind of arms race, we wouldn't have the bulk of pharmaceuticals that we rely on for human health. So these are just some examples of the roles that just one sector of that insect community when it comes to insect pollination provide to the world around us. And of course, insect pollinators come in many different forms. These are kind of 6 of the major insect groups that are really key and important pollinators. And many of these are quite common to all of us, right? It's butterflies, the most kind of visible and charismatic group of insects, bees, which are sort of the heavy lifting crew and arguably the most effective and efficient pollinators, flies, which are horribly understudied, but are extremely efficient and effective pollinators, many beetles, the nocturnal community of moths, which are again poorly understood and poorly studied, and then other insects such as wasps, which provide, along with flies, other benefits such as natural pest control in the landscapes around us. So again, there are other insect groups that do provide the service of pollination, but these are probably the 6 sort of dominant, most visible and charismatic groups that we can find around us. And just to drive home the importance to our home state of Florida, insect pollination is required for the Sunshine State's 47 kind of different crops within Florida, about 43% of all the crop species grown in the state. And that number is a fluid number because we get new crops coming into Florida on a regular basis. We have collectively a little over 200 different agricultural commodities So it's almost at the 50% mark of the roles that insects play in driving that economy and food productivity within the state of Florida. And if you look just at the economic contribution, it's about $50 million per crop for the 7 most valuable crops within Florida. And collectively on an annual basis, that equates to a little over $1 billion annually. So that's the direct impact of insects to Florida agriculture. And that affects obviously the broader economy, jobs, food prices, food security, and increasingly Florida and the Southeast is going to be important and critical to meeting the challenge of feeding the estimated 10 billion people on the planet Earth by 2050. So as sort of pollinators go, so does the agricultural community, ecology, and overall productivity across the globe. And it also, of course, really helps with the sustainability and resilience of systems. So, whether it be changes due to climate change, whether it be habitat loss and fragmentation, whether it be overuse of insecticides or other anthropomorphic changes, really we're putting insects through a pretty severe trial by fire, no pun intended. And that background of diversity is really our safety net. And so you could say that, well, obviously the Western honeybee does a significant service of pollination, but I'd like to equate it to kind of a stock portfolio. If you have all your stocks in one high performing stock, if things go bad, all your money goes down with it. However, if you have a diversified portfolio of that background of insect pollination and all the different insect groups providing that service, they're much more resilient to changes because they have different lifestyles, they have different life histories, they have different behaviors and phenology, and they can adapt more readily to those changes. And there's been many studies also showing that while bees are arguably the most effective and efficient pollinator group because they go to a blossom for nectar, but also for pollen for the developing brood, but that background group of other non-bee insects actually do more floral visits. And so they really are that background safety net. If bees continue to decline, all these other insect groups can kind of help make up for that one kind of heavy lifting crew of insects. So as insect diversity goes, so does sustainability and resilience of systems. And if you look simply at native bees, which are an incredibly fascinating group of insects, globally, there's about 20,000 species of bees. Within North America, 4,000. And within Florida, a pretty diverse state, we have about 316 bees that are known to be found within Florida, of which 29 are fully endemic to the state. And that includes, a wide range of large and small bees, social and non-social bees, ground nesting bees, twig nesting bees. So it's a really fascinating group to get out and watch and attract to your landscape because they are just amazingly industrious and amazingly unique organisms. And you can compare that to butterflies, which are arguably the most charismatic group, but 18,000 species worldwide, 750 within the United States, and 190 species approximately within Florida. So comparably, these groups are pretty close to one another. And butterflies, of course, are avid flower visitors. And while not as efficient as bees, they do move pollen from one flower to another and aid in both wild species pollination as well as crop pollination. And of course, the biggest challenge we're facing is the loss of biodiversity on this planet. And there's been much attention raised about the loss and decline of insect species, including some fairly unique headlines like the one on the upper left, the insect apocalypse is here, which is from the New York Times, even the cover of Science, insect decline. So there's been more and more studies showing that undoubtedly insects are in fairly steep decline, especially major groups that are well known like Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, and native bees, primarily because that's where we have the bulk of the data. We have good kind of baseline data for those groups. We know that they're in decline, but there is a lot of debate to this, and there's a lot of argument about the methodologies for some studies and the actual slope of the decline. But I think we shouldn't take too much issue with that, because we ultimately know that we're headed in the wrong direction on this planet. And that means that we really have to look at systems beyond wild conservation lands to make up that ground. And I love the diagram on the far left of this slide. It's from a paper by Dave Wagner, and it's the center of the diagram shows death by 1,000 cuts. And it emphasizes the fact that for insects and biodiversity as a whole, there's not one singular driver that's really taking everything out, that it really is this kind of network of threats that are eating away at the margins of diversity, everything from fire, droughts, climate change, agricultural intensification, to the more readily identifiable things such as habitat loss and degradation. But it does show the multitude of threats that we as humans are putting insects and the bulk of biodiversity through, and it's amazing how resilient they actually are. But to combat this, of course, as I mentioned, we have to rely on landscapes that are not simply in conservation. And this includes farmscapes, it includes urban and suburban landscapes, non-traditional conservation spaces such as rights-of-way in transportation or energy. And this is primarily because insects and other biodiversity is declining even on conservation land. The landscapes that we have and held for preserving life on Earth are no longer adequate to maintain that level of diversity and richness. So we have to rely on other landscapes and manage those more effectively. And let's not tease ourselves, all these landscapes are managed landscapes, wild lands to urban spaces. And so the goal really is to look at these spaces, these landscapes, and say, how can we manage them more effectively to conserve life on this Earth? And ultimately for insects, because they're small, they don't require as much space, insects are a great model for how to look at these landscapes and potentially enhance them or manage them more appropriately to maintain that background of insect diversity across all these different spaces. And this is important primarily because, again, we're facing all these challenges. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of debate about that decline of insects and biodiversity as a whole, of what we're actually losing. But there's a really nice piece by Matthew Forster and Scott Black that said, well, we can argue all day about the actual steepness of the decline of insects or whether one study was appropriately designed or analyzed, but we know enough to act now. We know that biodiversity is decreasing and decreasing significantly. And so why not take the proactive approach and get out there and manage these landscapes, restore these landscapes with aggressive nature right now, and kind of an all hands on deck approach? Because if it turns out that 10 years from now, the declines were not as severe as we once thought, well, there's no harm in doing what we're trying to do and restore landscapes. It's only going to have a net positive benefit. So time is a wasting. Let's get out and let's do something to help restore these systems and manage more appropriately for insects and other biodiversity. And so if you look at other landscapes, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research that my lab and others at UF have done across all these different landscapes, and they're highly relatable to one another, and lessons learned in one landscape can oftentimes be applied to others. And so we'll start with agro ecosystems or agricultural landscapes. And this is a landscape that has received a lot of attention when it comes to managing or tweaking management for the services of pollination, because of the importance of insects to the agricultural economy. And one of the main ways that many conservationists and growers have approached this is to augment these landscapes with other blooming plants, to draw in and support native insect pollinators and hope that they spill over onto a target crop adjacent to those plantings of, say, wildflowers as pictured in this particular slide. And this has been a proven model that if you plant it, they really will come, and it supports a fairly diverse array of not only pollinating insects, but a wide range of other highly beneficial insects that can provide a multitude of services to that agricultural crop, including natural pest control. And so one of the things that we did is we tried to test this model at several working farms up in north central Florida. And so this is a working farm at one of the University of Florida's Research and Education Centers. And in the background is a crop of squash going in, and the foreground is an acre of a mixed wildflower meadow. And you can see just a few species, Coreopsis, annual phlox, and a few others that are highly visible. And the goal here again is to draw in pollinators to this landscape, hopefully provide not only resources for them, but actually true habitat. And if you were actually to walk out into this wildflower meadow and look down at the ground, you would see a number of ground nesting bees and burrows into the ground. So this is acting not only as a resource and an attraction, but also as true habitat. And the goal would hopefully be that as this builds up populations of pollinators, they would spill onto the target crop. And if you do the survey work and you monitor these, the activity of these organisms, what you find is that these enhanced margins compared to fallow land attract almost 19 times as many bees as lands that are simply maintained or plowed without any resources provided for native pollinators. So this is proven to actually work and work quite well. The challenge, however, is it takes land out of production. And so there is a trade-off value that growers have to deal with if this is the model moving forward. And this can easily be applied to large and small landscapes, to your home garden by diversifying your landscape, providing additional companion plants that not only provide color and attraction, but really will attract and sustain those pollinators to make your garden more productive. And so this is truly a scalable model that can be applied to any kind of grower landscape, large and small. But as I mentioned, the challenge is you're taking land out of production or taking it away from an area where you could grow a productive crop. So the other model might be to look at adjacent landscapes. What is adjacent to an agricultural field that might provide the same level of attraction and habitat? And this is a picture, obviously, of a Florida roadway outside the city of Newberry. And this was taken back in 2012, one of the best North Central Florida wildflower years I've seen in Florida since I've been here. And it's a bouquet of resources for pollinators. And I grew up in Wisconsin, where going along roadsides was a great place to find rare plants, great place to find bugs and other insects. And so when I came down to Florida, I was always mystified by the fact that why doesn't the Department of Transportation manage landscapes along roadways more effectively for this diversity of wildlife that it can attract? Because obviously roadsides, what do they do to agricultural land? They bisect or run adjacent to pretty much every agricultural and wild landscape within Florida. So instead of taking land out of production, you can imagine that the adjacent landscape, if managed appropriately, has a wealth of resources, and insects, particularly pollinators, are mobile, so they can move kilometers within that landscape. So if the roadside adjacent to a grower field is diverse and productive, it's going to attract a highly diverse array of insects, theoretically, that could provide that natural pest control and pollination service to the adjacent crop. And so we really want to test this. And of course, for Department of Transportation across the US, their main mode of management is roadside mowing, both for safety as well as for aesthetics. And in Alachua County, Florida, this mowing frequency, it varies across the state, but in Alachua County, their mowing frequency is about every 3 weeks, which seems amazingly ridiculous, the fact that they would actually mow that many times. Even though it is Florida in a tropical climate, the fact that that is a huge waste of manpower, of carbon, of resources. So we were curious as to the effect of mowing frequency on both the insect community as well as on the floral community along roadsides. So we worked with the Department of Transportation to design a study that was a repeated block that looked at varying the frequency of mowing at various landscapes across North Central Florida roadways. And so we looked at really 3 different mowing frequencies, one which was the norm every 3 weeks, one that was double the norm every 6 weeks, and then a no mow control. And we went out along these roadways and we laid down quadrats, and we measured the number of blooms, so we could quantify the area of bloom. We categorized every species within that quadrat, and we also passively collected the insects that were visiting that right of way, the kind of the attraction value of what insects would naturally be occurring within that right of way, and then of course brought all that information back to the lab, identified the organisms down to the lowest possible level that we could, quantified all the botanical data. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that roadsides are incredibly diverse. This is not surprising, or at least it should not be surprising. But we found in the roadways that we surveyed about 133 different species of herbaceous flowering plants, 42 families represented, 11 orders, and 147 families of insects as well. So not only a rich floral array, but an incredibly rich and diverse insect array. And then I don't expect you to really see this graph in detail, but the big takeaway is that as you go from every 3 weeks to every 6 weeks, there was a significant increase in bloom abundance and the number of insects that were found within those rights-of-ways. So it shows that a slight alteration, not massive alteration in management, can have really profound effects. And so much so that every 6-week mow treatment was equivalent to not mowing throughout the growing season. So from a Department of Transportation point of view, they don't have to completely alter what they do. They can simply tweak their overall management to benefit the insect and floral community along roadways. And so this was a really profound kind of answer to our question with this study, and something that I was not necessarily anticipating. And the other thing we did with this study is we actually measured the level of insect mortality along roadways, because one of the biggest questions is, if you plant it or you maintain it and insects frequent these roadways, are you simply providing an increased area for insects to have that encounter with a moving vehicle? So is it counterproductive to the insect community? And what we found was actually no, it's actually quite beneficial to the insect community. In areas where mowing was curtailed, there was significantly less insect mortality compared to areas where they mowed more frequently. And this is because theoretically insects will stay within the margin of the roadside where the resources actually are. They don't have to travel as far to find resources between individual blooms. So it actually does not negatively impact insect mortality. And in February of 2022, this was also the picture of Fresh from Florida, which is the trade magazine for the Department of Agriculture in Florida. And this highlighted some of the roadside work that my lab has done, as well as others. And this is really the first time in my recollection that the Department of Agriculture recognized the importance of roadways to the production of food. So we were making really good strides in making that connection. And I hope this is something we can build on moving forward, because it really ties two different types of landscapes together and two sister agencies together that can work for mutual benefit for one another. And then of course, roadsides, beyond simply providing resources for pollinating organisms, they of course potentially can provide resources for highly valued charismatic organisms, such as the monarch pictured on this slide. And of course, milkweeds are the dominant host of monarchs and also provide nectar to a wider range of other insects. And you can see the monarch caterpillar and the adult monarch enjoying this pink milkweed, or Asclepias incarnata flower on this picture. And so the other thing we were really curious about is, how are roadsides doing to help conserve the monarch? And so we again worked with the Department of Transportation, and we went and monitored all FDOT maintained roads from about Ocala to Jacksonville and over to Tallahassee to actually survey and count the individual number of milkweed plants along roadways, focusing primarily on this species of milkweed. This is pine woods milkweed, Asclepias humistrata, which is arguably one of the most important milkweeds to the return migration of monarchs in the southeast each spring from the mountains of Mexico and their overwintering colonies. And this is a plant that right now is in full bloom along North Central Florida roadways. And so we drove these roadways, we used GIS and other tools to help drill down into where we could ultimately locate these plants. And once we found populations, we went out and we actually counted and measured the occurrence of these plants along roadways. And so every blue highway or roadway highlighted on this map have high density of milkweed plants. The areas highlighted in red have ultra high densities of milkweed. So we surprisingly found that roadways are really good for maintaining populations of milkweeds. And this particular study was aimed at providing DOT with more kind of details of where these populations occur. So if they want to make direct changes to their mowing frequency or other management strategies to help benefit the monarch, they know exactly where to start these high density roadways where milkweed populations abound. And then another project we have with the Department of Transportation takes advantage of another DOT maintained property type, and that is retention basins. This is obviously stormwater retention basins found along roadways are a common sight across Florida, but traditionally they're just sort of waste areas. They have really limited conservation value, but yet they occupy a lot of space. They're essentially connecting like beads along a chain to aid in insect movement, but they're not maintained in any particular way to benefit insects or other wildlife. So we have a pilot 3-year project looking at revegetating dry and wet retention basins to benefit the general pollinator community and also monarchs in particular by planting at least 2 different species of dry adapted milkweed in dry retention basins and wet adapted milkweed plants and species in wet retention basins to monitor not only the use of monarchs by in these areas, but also the general pollinator community. And this is a highly rewarding project because we get our hands dirty. We get out in the field with the Department of Transportation, and we do a heck of a lot of planting. Over the past 2 years of this project, we probably put in a little over 2,500 plants at a network of retention basins outside the city of Chiefland in North Central Florida. And so we hope to use this as a model to drill down into not only the establishment of plants and what works best and best practices, but also sort of the economics of this project. And hopefully, if it reaches an ideal sort of price point, that DOT might be interested in replicating this model in other areas of Florida and even across the deep south to aid in insect conservation in previously underutilized or underappreciated habitat types. And then I was telling Jennifer, I just had a field day today, and one of the other projects that we're doing with the Department of Transportation along roadways is trying to better understand how milkweed populations fare over time as FDOT alters their management frequency and management type for mowing. And so instead of doing this all by hand, which is a heck of a lot of labor, we're trying to use artificial intelligence and machine learning and drones to survey roadside. So you can see in the far right-hand picture, a drone flying over a roadside area. And we're trying to ultimately see how detectable these milkweed plants are from well above the roadside to use machine learning to actually measure and monitor these plants through time, which would be much more cost effective and efficient for agencies like the Department of Transportation. And we also hope to kind of use this technology to also quantify bloom abundance and even species occurrence along roadways for the general insect community as a whole. And all of this feeds in ultimately to an agreement that Department of Transportations across the US and energy providers are entering in with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which is called the Nationwide Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances for the Monarch Butterfly. Horrible name, but a really good program. And you can see that the Department of Transportation here in Florida is a member of this group. And essentially they enter into agreement, and within that agreement, they ultimately decide on the quantity of land that they're going to manage effectively for the monarch. And so they agree ultimately to set aside and manage land specifically for the monarch butterfly along roadways. And we're trying to help them kind of effectively monitor those roadways for the monarch and for this program, and help them ultimately become more efficient with what they do through time. But this is a really good agreement and a really good step forward for insect conservation in general. And then sort of the last landscape I want to talk a little bit about tonight is kind of the urban space, the built environment in particular. And you could argue that obviously all of these landscapes are the built environment, but this is the one where maybe presents the biggest challenge to conservation. And of course, we know that urban areas are rapidly growing. You don't have to look anywhere but the state of Florida to see how development is encroaching on natural lands by the daily basis. And of course, according to the US Census, over 80% of Americans already live in or near cities. So this is an increasingly populated space where green space is limited, but opportunity is large, especially for connecting people to nature and managing landscapes appropriately for conservation moving forward. And if you look at Florida, as I mentioned, it's rapidly developing, and this is unfortunately what we're seeing as the future of Florida. And you could argue, of course, that this is not a good direction for conservation, but I don't want to be a bummer tonight. I don't want to take the negative view. And so I'm going to try to turn this on its head and say, well, yes, you could view this as a negative, but what do each of these individual houses have? They have a landscape. And so if one homeowner diversifies their property and their neighbor goes along with that and says, that's a great thing, and their neighbor's neighbor does the same thing, this is a huge opportunity space to say each of these individual property owners can make a real difference for conservation. And that's really, I think, how we have to approach the future of urban biodiversity. And so as an example, if you look at this South Florida home, it's a beautiful home. It probably retails for $750,000 or more. But if you're an insect entering into this landscape, there's not a lot of resources for you here. This is a turf grass dominated system where insecticides are probably heavily used. You don't see any blooming plants anywhere. So essentially, this is a desert for a pollinating organism. So we have to take this landscape and say, how do we change it through time and diversify it so it looks more like this? And this might be the more extreme example of what a native Florida yard or a combo hybrid yard might look by adding and diversifying native plants and other blooming resources in that landscape. But one thing we know really well through research, and that is that as you increase the diversity of blooming plants within landscapes, insects come along. And it doesn't take a lot of resources to make insects happy. This is not, starting from scratch, ripping out all the sod of your landscape and redeveloping your home landscape. This is simply moving in baby steps towards a set goal of diversifying your landscape to provide additional resources for insects and other wildlife. And hopefully in that process, you get more enjoyment out of your landscape. It enhances the retail sale value, the eye candy street value sale of your home. You obviously save in costs of insecticides and water use. So there's a lot of upside from the individual homeowner to doing this, and a tremendous upside for wildlife. But what we were interested in my lab is, is it as simple as you plant it and they will come, or is it more nuanced in the configuration or the actual landscape design? How much does that influence how insects might use an individual space? So there's a lot more research going into understanding how to effectively design and create green space for wildlife and for insects in particular. And one of the studies in collaboration with another researcher here, Adam Dale, and his student, was really looking and testing this model that in relation to the monarch in this context, there's a lot of energy in planting milkweed for monarchs within urban spaces and larger landscapes. But doesn't matter if you plant simply a monoculture of milkweeds or you plant a mixed planting of milkweeds and other resources. And so we tested this in the field by planting simply a one species dominant monoculture, and then a diverse system that had 2 species of milkweed and about 3 to 4 different species of blooming plants. And what we found was that monarch butterflies actually preferred the mixed species plot, and they actually laid more eggs on that mixed species plot than they did on the monoculture. And if you also look at the insect diversity as a whole, that mixed species plot had significantly more predators and other insects within that plot than the monoculture. But even though it had more predators and parasitoids, it did not negatively affect the survival of monarch larvae within that mixed species plot. So it shows dramatically that mixed species plots or mixed species plantings have a significant upside compared to simply a monoculture of a single species for conservation in this context for the monarch. And then we were also interested in looking at this as a whole for the flower visiting insect community. And we embarked on a 3-year study looking at comparing conventional landscapes, which is basically like that house pictured on the center of the right-hand picture of the slide, a picture of a landscape, that has virtually no resources for wildlife, the typical kind of big box store landscaped yard compared to a Florida-friendly yard, which has more blooming resources, some mix of native, some mix of ornamental, but significantly more resources available for wildlife, and then transitioning to an almost all native yard. And so what we did is we sampled 34 different suburban yards over about 2 years, and we assessed everything from nearest green space size, distance to green space, the yard area, plant richness, bloom abundance, and then of course we captured passively the insect community that visited that landscape. And surprisingly, many of these landscapes are pretty diverse as you go, especially towards native, where we recorded a significant number of insects visiting those lands. And we essentially went in and monitored every individual plant that was in those yards, counted every bloom on these landscapes. So again, a lot of work, but really interesting results. And so what we found essentially is that if you want to design a landscape, your home landscape, you want to increase the visitation and the benefit of your landscape to pollinating insects, 3 things are really the most critical. One is plant diversity, which seems pretty obvious. The more different types of plants you have, theoretically, the more different types of insects you will attract. Bloom abundance, which again is a pretty obvious thing. The more flowering resources you have, theoretically, the more attractive that yard will be to insects. But one thing that was surprising is that the evenness of that community was really significant. In fact, it was a modulator of those other 2 variables. And so what community evenness is essentially a representation of the number of species and their numbers within the landscape. So a very uneven landscape would be 100 different species of plants in a landscape with only 1 individual represented per species. A more even yard would be 10 individual representatives of 10 different species across that landscape. And so if you want to have an impact in increasing the attractive value of your yard, pick some of the best blooming plants that you can think of and maximize their occurrence within the landscape. And that's going to provide a significant impact value to the attractiveness of insects versus simply the kid in the candy store approach, which is trying to go and buy one of everything and put that into your yard. And this was somewhat novel outcomes that we were not anticipating. But if you look at other resources, this has also been found within natural pest control, within organic farming, that more even communities of resources attract and sustain a higher percentage of predators and pathogens within those landscapes. So there's significant value for not only attracting insects, but also attracting highly beneficial insects, pollinators, predators, and parasitoids to landscapes by maximizing the evenness of that plant community within your landscape. And of course, the big end goal is how do we connect these individual landscapes over space in a larger area, whether a neighborhood or an urban community as a whole, and linking those with one yard to another yard to other urban green space. And if we do so appropriately, we will really have a significant impact on preserving and maximizing the biodiversity left within those systems, and provide additional ways and avenues for people to connect to those green spaces and ultimately connect back to nature. And I think we all know that this is incredibly important, that we connect people to nature, that this has to happen sooner than later. We realized a little this with the pandemic, where people could sequester themselves at home, and sort of the value that provided to people to reconnect to their landscapes. But now we have to move forward with ensuring that this happens, and happens more readily, and we have more avenues of those connections within the built environment for the health benefits, the societal benefits, the biodiversity benefits, really designing spaces that have mutual benefits to both humans and nature. And if we do so effectively, then we'll really have an impact across the increasingly built environment. And then I'm going to end by just talking a little bit about another area that my lab is working on, and we're working on here at UF, and that is, if you look at designing your landscape, that's one thing, but how do you effectively purchase plants in the most wise way possible? And this is a challenge for most consumers, especially those that are uninformed about the value of native plants, or really uninformed of how to ultimately make high quality plant selections, simply because there's so much information out there, and there's also so many plant choices available to the average consumer. So we designed a project specifically, again, focusing on the monarch, and particularly tropical milkweed, because this is a highly contested resource for the monarch, but it's also the #1 available commercial milkweed, available pretty much across much of the southern tier of the US. But it provides many challenges to the monarch and can disrupt the monarch migration. But another big issue with this plant is, if you look at the number of chemicals used in production, it really can be quite deleterious to the monarch. In fact, we looked at this in general by calling every big box store in Florida, finding out where they source their tropical milkweed from, called those growers, and found out the individual chemicals used in production for this plant for the general public. And what we found is that growers use a wide range of different highly toxic systemic insecticides to produce this plant, many of which are incredibly toxic to the monarch butterfly and defeat the whole purpose of actually growing this plant for wildlife, because these chemicals reside in the plant tissues for an extended period of time. And even as a homeowner, if you buy them from a store, plant them in your landscape, they're essentially unusable for a period of time by the monarch. And so what we found, and we tested these chemicals in laboratory assays, we found that the most frequently used chemicals yielded mortality rates of larvae, of monarch larvae. About 50 to 75% of larvae would die on the plant treated with those chemicals. And if we actually went out and bought the plants from the store as they were coming off the truck and put monarch larvae on those plants, we got almost 99% mortality. So this is really catastrophic levels of mortality for the monarch, and again, flies in the face of what these plants are supposedly being grown for, to benefit a target organism that it itself is declining. So as a result of that, we realized that we need to provide consumers with more information available to make sound choices. So we started a pilot project to look at developing a UF wildlife friendly plant certification program, where we would evaluate the attractiveness value of commonly commercially available plants. And we would also evaluate the chemical inputs used during production to ensure that we could ultimately work with growers to use less lethal chemicals and still provide effective pest control in production, so that when in the future, if this program is successful, when you go to a big box store or a nursery and you have a UF label on that plant, you can buy in confidence that that plant was deemed to be wildlife friendly or wildlife safe for purchase to use in your home landscape. And we're again using the monarch as a test system and tropical milkweed to evaluate a wide range of different pest control measures for milkweed use by growers, and those that are ultimately deemed to be less toxic to the monarch butterfly itself. And so this is early days for this project, but we are very hopeful that in years upcoming, we will ultimately develop this into a full-blown U of certification program and a trialing system here in Florida to really evaluate commercially grown plants for wildlife value. And then lastly, relating back to green space and urban environments for insects, one of the biggest challenges we have facing is, you can plant it, but how do you maintain it appropriately for the insect community, especially in Florida, where the average homeowner does not do the landscape maintenance themselves, but they hire a landscape maintenance company or firm or individual to come into that landscape to maintain that. And so we've started a UF graduate and professional training program for pollination, ecology, health, and conservation that professionals can take to better understand how to manage landscapes that are increasingly diverse for wildlife in an appropriate way that will not cause direct harm to the wildlife that that landscape is trying to attract. And this is, trying to move and steer the Queen Mary in a direction, but we are hopeful that this will be a very productive program at UF where we can provide real training to professionals to potentially, provide a niche market to help, reach out to homeowners and provide effective management in a tailored way that can benefit these increasingly native and naturalized and diverse landscapes moving forward. So with that, I'll say thank you to Jennifer and all of you, and really thank our many sponsors and funders for the research that I highlight tonight, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. Thank you very much.